term that's been thrown around a lot lately is FLOPS, more specifically teraflops. Do the people using this term really know what it means? Probably not. They seem to think that it's a measure of speed, when in truth, it's really not. So let's start by figuring out exactly what a teraflop is. Obviously, it's got the prefix tera, which means trillion. So a teraflop is 1 trillion flops. So then what's a flop? Well, it's an acronym that stands for floating point operation per second. Which means what? Does that tell me how good my game's gonna look? Does it tell me how many frames I'm gonna get? No, this is not at all what flops tell us. It does tell us the speed a computer can process the operations, but this does not mean that it will always process at this speed. Normally, the advertised flops is the maximum calculated speed, much like a car's advertised top speed. Well, that means that the more flops I have, the faster my system will run, the better it'll run, right? Nope. There are many cases where a system with lower flops have been able to work just as well, and sometimes even better than a system with more. A good example of this is the AMD Radeon R9 Fury X with 8.6 teraflops, and the NVIDIA GTX 1070 with 6.5 teraflops. The 1070 managed to match and even sometimes outperform the Fury X in nearly all games. Well, why is this? The Fury X has more teraflops and therefore is the faster card, right? This is where stuff gets a little more complicated. The simple answer as to why the cards perform the same even if one is faster is because of the underlying architecture. The architecture is how the parts actually work. It's how everything gets processed. This has a far greater impact on performance than the actual teraflops. Another important part is the drivers. So the drivers are the software that powers the hardware. There's also other hardware factors that affect performance. How fast is the memory? How much memory does it have to work with? What's the memory bandwidth? Yeah, that's a lot of memory hardware. There's many factors that relate to performance, and simply knowing the teraflops means almost nothing in most cases. So then, why do people care? What good is knowing the flops? Well, flops tell us the raw computational power, how many calculations it can do per second. If you have 6 teraflops, you can calculate 2 plus 3, 6 trillion times per second. This is extremely important for stuff that needs to do immense amounts of calculations, something like a supercomputer. These are used to calculate stuff like weather systems, how a city works, earthquakes, orbits, space travel. These are all math-based, and with more teraflops, they can be calculated more accurately and more efficiently. When it comes down to gaming, teraflops doesn't tell us a whole lot, since most of what you see isn't math-based. They're done using different methods that the raw power doesn't have the largest impact on. That's not to say that a GPU with 1 gigaflop will perform as well as a GPU with 1 teraflop, but the difference between 1 teraflop and 2 teraflops probably isn't as big as you'd expect. If you want to learn more, I'll post a link to another video in the description below. It's with 2 guys that know quite a bit more about this stuff than I do, so there's a lot more information. Please check it out. Aesthetics. For me, my PC is basically my child. I've had her for years. She has a name. It's Lara, named after Lara Croft. And water cooling is something I've always wanted to do to just make her look. Those are the specs that they recommend to play with max settings at 4K resolution with a minimum of 60 frames per second. Next, they go into what